My name is Marisol Navarro. I am 63 years old, and I spent 41 years believing that if you gave your family everything, your time, your labor, your silence, they would eventually see it. I was wrong. I retired on a Thursday in March. The party was small: my supervisor, 2 colleagues from the billing department, a sheet cake from the grocery store down the block. My supervisor said I had been the most reliable person on the floor for 2 decades. She said it the way people say things at retirement parties, warmly, quickly, already thinking about who would take my desk. I drove home alone, let myself into the house I'd owned for 19 years, sat down at the kitchen table and thought, now what? I had worked in hospital billing administration for 31 years. Before that, 10 years of bookkeeping for a plumbing supply company that went under in the 90s. I understood systems. I understood the way money moved through institutions, where it got stuck, where it leaked. I could look at a ledger and tell you within 4 minutes where the error was. That skill, patient, methodical, unremarkable to everyone who didn't have it, had paid the mortgage, funded my son Marco's college education, and kept the lights on through 2 recessions and 1 divorce. There was a folder in the lower drawer of my desk at home, labeled the way I had always labeled things I intended to return to: property, reference. I had not yet had the time to read what was in it. If any of this sounds familiar, if you've ever given everything you had to people who treated your time like it cost nothing, I want you to stay with me, because what happened next took me 6 months to fully understand, and I think you'll recognize something in it. I was 3 weeks into retirement when Renata called. Marco was 34. He worked in logistics for a regional freight company, a job he'd held for 6 years and complained about for 5. His wife, Renata, was 31. She had a lifestyle brand, that was the word she used, brand, centered on travel content. She posted photographs of herself in hotel lobbies, at airport terminals, holding small glasses of juice in places with good light. She had, by her own accounting, 240,000 followers. Whether that translated into income one genuinely did not know. Marco handled their finances. Or Renata did. I had never been invited into that conversation. They had 3 children. Tomas, who was 7. The twins, Pilar and Sebastian, who were 5. The children were loud and quick and affectionate in the scattered way that small children are. They wanted you until they didn't, and then they were gone. I loved them completely. I babysat when asked, which was often enough that I had a dedicated drawer in my kitchen for their snacks. My retirement was not unexpected. My knees had been giving me trouble for 2 years, and the commute, 40 minutes each way on a good day, had started to cost me more than it returned. I had savings. I had a small pension. I had my garden, which I'd let go during the working years and planned to bring back. I had, for the first time in 4 decades, time that belonged entirely to me. I was in the backyard pulling up dead growth from the rose bed when my phone rang. I had dirt on my hands and my knees were protesting the crouch. I almost let it go to voicemail. I answered on the 4th ring. Renata's voice was bright and brisk, the way it always was when she had already decided something. Marisol, she said. I need to talk to you about something. I set my trowel down on the edge of the raised bed and straightened up as much as my knees would allow. Go ahead, I said. So you know I have the Barcelona trip coming up. The one I've been planning since January. I did know. She had mentioned it at Christmas, at Marco's birthday dinner in February, and once more in a text she'd sent me in early March that I hadn't fully responded to because I hadn't known what she was asking. I remember, I said. It's 3 weeks. And then from Barcelona I'm going directly to Lisbon for the follow-up content. So actually closer to 4 weeks total, maybe a little more depending on how the Portugal leg goes. I waited. Marco's project at work runs through June. He can't take that kind of time off. And the kids can't miss school. Tomas just started 2nd grade and you know how his teacher is about attendance. She paused, but it was the pause of someone who had already written the next sentence. You're retired now. You don't have anything going on. It just makes sense for you to come stay at our place and watch the kids while I'm gone. The rose bed was in front of me. The dead canes needed cutting back to the bud union. I had a pair of bypass pruners hanging on the fence hook. I looked at them. That's 5 weeks, I said. 4. Maybe 4.5. Renata, that's. You're not working anymore, she said. I mean, what else are you doing? The kids know you, they love you. It's not like I'm asking a stranger. You'd literally just be there, making sure they get to school and fed and in bed. Marco would be home at night. You'd have your evenings. I folded my free hand around the phone a little tighter. There was something in the word literally, the way she'd used it to compress what she was describing into nothing, into a task so small it barely warranted the asking. I'll think about it, I said. I need to book the additional hotel nights by Friday, so. Another pause. I just figured you'd want to help. You're their grandmother. She hung up before I could answer. I stood in the backyard for a moment. The pruners were still on the fence hook. I picked them up and went back to the roses, and I didn't think about Renata's call for the rest of the afternoon, which was the only way I knew how to manage something that was already making my chest feel like a closed fist. That was not the first time Renata had reduced me to a utility. The pattern had started, as these things often do, so gradually that I'd missed it entirely the first few times. It was not dramatic. It never announced itself. It arrived in small phrases, in the way she positioned things, in what she included me in and what she did not. The first time I noticed it clearly was at Tomas's 5th birthday party. This would have been 2 years before the phone call in the garden. Marco and Renata had rented a small venue, a community room at a rec center near their house, and invited about 30 people, friends of theirs, Renata's sister, a handful of Tomas's classmates. I had driven 40 minutes to get there, brought a gift I'd spent 2 weeks thinking about, a wooden puzzle set Tomas had mentioned wanting 3 months earlier. I arrived on time, which meant I arrived before the guests. Renata was arranging the food table when I walked in. She looked up, smiled in the way that doesn't reach the eyes, and said, "Oh good, you can take the kids to the bounce house area while I finish setting up. Marco's parking the car." Not "good to see you." Not "thank you for coming." Not even a greeting that acknowledged I was a guest at my own grandson's birthday party. I took the children to the bounce house area. I sat on a folding chair for an hour and a half watching Tomas and the twins jump while the adults ate and talked at the other end of the room. Marco came and sat with me for 20 minutes before Renata called him back. Nobody brought me a plate. When the cake was served, someone waved me over. On the drive home, I told myself it was a busy day and she hadn't meant anything by it. People get frantic at parties. It was easy to overlook details. I believed this. The second time was clearer. It was Marco and Renata's wedding anniversary, 18 months before the garden phone call. They had planned a weekend trip, just the two of them, which I thought was good. I was glad to hear they were doing that. Renata called on a Tuesday evening and explained that they'd be leaving Friday afternoon and back Sunday night, and could I stay at their place with the kids. Of course, I said. What time on Friday? We'll leave around noon, so if you could be there by 11:30. I rearranged 3 things I'd planned for that Friday: a dentist appointment I'd waited 6 weeks for, a lunch with a colleague, and an oil change I'd been putting off, and I drove to their house at 11:15. I had my overnight bag. I had snacks. I had a new book Marco had recommended. They left at noon exactly. The weekend was fine. The children were good. I cooked, I supervised baths, I read stories, I washed and folded 2 loads of laundry that had been sitting in the dryer. On Sunday evening, Renata came home, walked through the living room and said, "Thanks, the kids look fine." She went upstairs. Marco hugged me and said, "You're the best, Mom." I drove home. No mention of what I'd moved. No acknowledgement that I'd rearranged my week to be there, that I'd washed their laundry, that I'd spent 2 evenings sitting with Sebastian because he'd been having bad dreams and wouldn't settle. I had done all of this because I loved the children and because Marco was my son. But there is a difference between giving freely and being assumed upon, and somewhere between Friday noon and Sunday evening I had moved from the first category to the second without anyone saying a word about it. There were other incidents. Smaller ones, some larger. A Christmas where Renata announced, in front of the whole family, that I'd offered to make the tamales, which I had not. She had told Marco she assumed I would, and Marco had not corrected her. I had made them anyway. I drove to their house at 7 in the morning on Christmas Eve, stood in their kitchen for 4 hours, and delivered the tamales to the table while Renata's mother photographed them for Renata's brand account. No one asked whether I wanted to sit down. A school pickup I'd been asked to do just this once. Tomas had gotten a low-grade fever and Renata was in a meeting she said she couldn't leave, that had quietly extended into every Tuesday for 4 months. I rearranged my physical therapy appointments twice to keep the schedule consistent. I never said anything because Tomas had started telling me about his day on those drives, the specific, unprompted kind of telling that 7-year-olds do when they finally trust you with the small things, and I didn't want to lose that. A time Renata had called while I was at a doctor's appointment and, when I called back 40 minutes later, said she'd already found someone else and that I was unreliable. Unreliable. 31 years of showing up. Not one sick day in my last 8 years at the hospital. Unreliable. I had paid for Marco's textbooks his freshman year because his financial aid disbursement was late and he'd called me on a Sunday in a panic. I had driven 3 hours round trip to help him move into his first apartment, and then driven 3 hours back because I had work the next morning. I had watched Tomas for 6 weeks when Renata had a brand partnership that required her to travel, and the twins were newborns then, barely sleeping, and I had been there every day. I had done all of this without complaint, without invoice, without ever once saying, "Here is what this cost me." And for all of it I had received a thanks, the kids look fine, and the unspoken assumption that my time, my retirement, my plans, my body, which ached in the knees and the lower back after a full week with 3 children under 7, all of it was simply available. On demand. Indefinitely. I squared this understanding away like a file I wasn't ready to open. I went back to the roses. Marco called that evening. His voice had the particular careful quality it took on when he was navigating between me and Renata, trying to keep both sides from touching. "Mom, did Renata talk to you today?" "She did," I said. "It would really mean a lot to us. She's been planning this for a long time, and the Barcelona leg is a real opportunity for her. There's a hotel partnership involved, some kind of sponsored content arrangement." I listened. "And I know it's a lot to ask," he said, not quite convincingly. "But the kids would be with you and you know them. It's not like they'd be with a stranger." "You said that," I told him. "Renata said that too." A pause. "So you'll think about it?" "I'm thinking about it right now," I said. What I did not tell Marco was that earlier that afternoon, after Renata had hung up and I'd gone back to the garden, I'd made a phone call of my own. To my sister Graciela, who lived 40 minutes south and had, for the past 9 months, been asking me to come visit and stay a while. She had a guest room. She had a garden of her own, bigger than mine. She had been asking me since October. I had said yes to Graciela that afternoon before Marco called. I had already booked the bus ticket. The question was not whether I was going to spend 4 weeks watching Renata's children while she photographed herself in European hotel lobbies. The question was whether I was going to tell Marco that directly, or whether I was going to let the situation develop the way Renata had let every situation develop, by presenting a conclusion as if it had already been decided, and waiting to see what happened next. I set down the notepad where I'd written Graciela's address. "I'll let you know by Friday," I told Marco. "Renata needs to know by Friday," he said. "Not I need to know. Renata needs to know." "Then you'll both know by Friday," I said, and I let him go. The call that changed everything came 8 days later. I was at Graciela's by then. I had packed a bag, told my neighbor to water the potted herbs on the back step, and driven south on a Sunday morning while the road was still quiet. Graciela had made coffee and we'd sat on her porch for 2 hours talking about nothing important, which was the most I'd talked about nothing in months. I had not told Marco I was leaving. I had texted him on Friday, "I won't be able to help with the trip. I have plans I can't change. I hope you find a good solution." That was all. No explanation. No apology. No offer to discuss it. The response had come back 47 minutes later, in Renata's voice even though it came from Marco's phone. "Are you serious? We planned this months ago. You literally have nothing else to do." I had read it once and set my phone face down on the kitchen counter. At Graciela's I was on my 5th day. My knees had stopped aching because I was not lifting toddlers or crouching on hard floors. I was sleeping past 7 for the first time since I could remember. I had repotted 6 of Graciela's succulents and started reading a novel I'd bought in February and never opened. It was a Wednesday morning when my phone rang. Not Marco. Renata directly. I looked at the screen for 2 rings. Then I answered. Marisol. Her voice was a register lower than usual. Not warm. "I think there's been some confusion." "There hasn't," I said. "I need you to understand that this trip is not optional for me. This is my work. You wouldn't tell Marco he couldn't go to his job." "Renata," I said, "you didn't ask me. You told me." A silence. "Then, I'm asking you now." "I already have plans." "What plans?" The warmth was completely gone. "You're retired. What could you possibly have that's more important than your grandchildren?" I looked out Graciela's kitchen window. There was a ceramic pot on the sill with a small cactus in it. I watched it for a moment. My plans are my own, I said. This is unbelievable. Her voice had gone tight and quick. You know what? Fine. I'll remember this. When you want to come to Tomas's birthday next month, when you want to see the kids at Christmas, I'll remember that when we actually needed you, you decided your little retirement was more important. My throat caught on something, not quite hurt, not quite anger, something that sat between the two and pressed upward. I breathed through it. You can remember whatever you'd like, I said. You do nothing, she said. You literally do nothing all day. You watch TV and pull weeds. And you can't give us 4 weeks. I squared the notepad in front of me before I answered. I'll be in touch, I said and ended the call. I sat at Graciella's kitchen table for a while after that. The cactus on the sill sat in its pot, patient and entirely unbothered. Outside, Graciella's garden was doing what it always did, growing quietly, without anyone watching. I had spent 41 years in systems. I knew how they worked. I knew how money moved, where it pooled, where it was hidden in plain sight. And I had known, since the moment I retired and started looking at my own finances with the unhurried attention my career had never allowed, something that Marco and Renata did not know I knew. Not because I had gone looking for trouble. Because I had always been the one who understood the ledger. And the ledger, as it turned out, had a great deal to say. Renata came back from Lisbon on a Tuesday. I knew because Marco texted me, she's home. Kids are good. We used a nanny service, it worked out fine. The text had the careful flatness of someone who had been coached on what to say, or who had decided on his own that the safest thing was to say as little as possible. I was still at Graciella's. I had extended my stay by 2 weeks because my knees were good and my novel was finished, and Graciella had started teaching me to make her version of arroz con leche, which was different from mine in 3 specific ways and better in all of them. I had thought about going home. I had decided there was no particular reason to rush. I texted Marco back, good. Glad it worked out. What I did not tell him was that 3 days before Renata landed at the airport, I had driven back to my own house for one afternoon. Not to pack. Not to check on anything. To retrieve the folder I kept in the lower drawer of my desk, the one I'd been meaning to read since before I retired, the one labeled property, reference, which nobody had ever asked about because it looked like exactly what it said it was. Inside that folder was a document I had read for the first time 11 months ago, when I had finally, in the unhurried way that retirement allows, sat down with the complete records of my mother's estate. My mother had died 4 years prior. The estate had been small, her house, a savings account, a few personal items. Marco was her only grandchild at the time, and she had adored him. What I had not known until I pulled every document and read them in order with the same attention I had given hospital billing ledgers for 3 decades, was that my mother had also held a partial interest in a commercial property. A strip of retail units 2 towns over, purchased with her sister in 1987, never discussed, never mentioned to me or to anyone as far as I could tell. Her sister had died in 2019. The property had passed through 2 ownership transfers in the years since. And somewhere in that chain, quietly, without fanfare, documented in county recorder filings that anyone could access if they knew to look, a trust had been established. My name was in it. Not Marco's. Not Renata's. Mine. The trust had been structured by my mother's estate attorney, a careful woman named Dolores Rios, who had retired 2 years ago but whose firm was still active. I had called the firm in January. I had had 3 conversations with a younger attorney there, a man named Calvo who spoke slowly and confirmed everything twice, which I appreciated. The asset value of the trust at current market assessment was $1.4 million. It had been sitting there, administered quietly, generating income that had been depositing into an account I hadn't known existed, for 4 years. 4 years. While I had been working morning shifts. While I had been watching Renata's children on Tuesday pickups. While I had rearranged my dentist appointment and driven 40 minutes in each direction and folded other people's laundry and been told I was unreliable. I had not told Marco. I had not told anyone. Not because I was planning something, not at first. But because I had learned in 31 years of working with numbers that information has a right time and a wrong time, and the wrong time is when the people around you are treating you like furniture. I brought the folder back to Graciella's and put it in my overnight bag. And then I waited for Renata to call. She called on a Thursday, 9 days after she landed. I was sitting in Graciella's front room when my phone rang. Marisol. Her voice was controlled. She had rehearsed this or something like it. I think we need to talk about what happened. All right, I said. I want you to understand that what you did affected this whole family. Marco had to manage everything from work. The nanny cost us nearly $3,000 for the month. $3,000 that we wouldn't have spent if you had just. Renata, I said. Where are you right now? A pause. I'm at the house. Is Marco there? He's at work. Are the children there? They're at school. A shorter pause, wary now. Why? I'd like to come over. I have some things I want to show you. The silence lasted 4 seconds. I counted them. Fine, she said. I drove to their house. I had the folder in my bag along with 3 additional documents I had printed at the library 2 days earlier. The county recorder filing, the trust summary prepared by Calvo, and a 1-page letter on firm letterhead confirming my status as the named beneficiary and primary trustee. Renata met me at the door. She had the look of someone prepared to be magnanimous, to accept an apology graciously, to allow things to return to the way they had been. She was wearing the kind of effortless outfit that takes effort to assemble. She smiled barely. Come in, she said. We sat at the kitchen table. The same kitchen table where I had sat with Tomas doing homework, where I had fed the twins their breakfast on a dozen different mornings, where I had folded their laundry and stacked it in neat piles that were still there when Renata came home and walked past them without comment. I set my bag on the chair beside me. I did not open it yet. You said there were things to show me, Renata said. In a moment, I said. First, I want to make sure I understand the situation correctly. You said the nanny cost $3,000. That's right. And your position is that I was responsible for that cost because I didn't make myself available. You retired, she said. You have nothing but time. I don't understand what was so important that you couldn't. You said I do nothing. I kept my voice level. You said I watch TV and pull weeds. Her jaw tightened slightly. I was frustrated. You also said, I reached into my bag and brought out the folder. I placed it on the table, not with drama, just set it down. That when we actually needed you, you decided your little retirement was more important. I opened the folder and laid the first document in front of her, the county recorder filing. I want to talk about what I was actually doing during my retirement. She looked at the document. Then at me. What is this? I laid the trust summary beside it. My mother passed away 4 years ago. You were at the service, you stood beside Marco and held his hand, and I remember that you squeezed my arm afterward and said you were sorry for my loss. I placed the firm letter on top of the other 2 aligned. I spent the last 11 months going through her estate properly. Something I hadn't had time to do while I was working. Renata picked up the letter. She read the first paragraph. Then she read it again. This says, 1.4 million, I said. In a property trust. My name. Not a joint account. Not a family account. Mine as primary trustee and sole beneficiary. She set the letter down. The income from the trust has been depositing for 4 years, I said. I've been working with an attorney to understand my options. One of those options, which I've already begun discussing with my financial advisor, is using a portion of the trust to purchase the unit adjacent to this neighborhood, the one on Crestview that's been sitting empty for 8 months. It's zoned mixed use. I've had 2 conversations with a commercial real estate broker. Renata's hands were very still on the table. I'm telling you this, I said, not because I want anything from you. I'm telling you because you asked what I was doing during my retirement. And I want to answer that question accurately. She didn't speak for a moment. Then she said carefully, Marisol, I think there may have been some misunderstanding between us. I squared the documents in front of me before I answered. There wasn't, I said. I want to read something back to you and I'd like you to listen. She was very still. At Tomas's 5th birthday, you looked up when I walked in and said, oh good, you can take the kids to the bounce house while I finish setting up. I had driven 40 minutes. I sat alone for 90 minutes while the adults ate. No one brought me a plate. I paused. What I was doing that afternoon while you were setting up the food table was showing up for my grandson. Not because my time costs nothing, because it doesn't. But because I had not yet understood that you believed it did. Renata opened her mouth. I continued. On your anniversary weekend, Marco told me you'd be leaving Friday at noon and asked me to be there by 11:30. I moved a dentist appointment I'd waited 6 weeks for, a lunch and an oil change. I stayed 2 nights. I cooked every meal. I washed 2 loads of your laundry that had been sitting in the dryer. I sat with Sebastian 2 evenings because he was having bad dreams and wouldn't settle. When you came home you said, "Thanks, the kids look fine." And you went upstairs. I let that sit for a moment. What I was doing that weekend was what I had always done. I just hadn't yet understood what it was worth to you. Her face had changed. The rehearsed magnanimity was entirely gone. And 9 days ago, I said, you called me and said, you do nothing. You literally do nothing all day. You watch TV and pull weeds. You said that when we actually needed you, I decided my retirement was more important. I picked up the trust summary and held it for a moment, then set it back on the pile. What I was doing during my retirement was reading every document in my mother's estate, having 3 conversations with an attorney, and understanding something that has taken me 11 months to fully map out. That is what I was doing while I was pulling weeds. I gathered the documents back into the folder. I closed it. I put it in my bag. I'm going to go pick up Tomas from school, I said. Because I want to, not because there's no one else. When Marco gets home, you can tell him whatever you'd like. I stood, picked up my bag and walked to the door. I let myself out without slamming it. Marco called that evening. He was quiet in a way I hadn't heard from him before, not the careful flatness of managed distance, but something more unsettled. Renata had told him. She had told him more, I thought, than she'd intended to, because some of what he said back to me suggested he was processing things in the order she'd presented them, which was not the order I would have chosen. "Mom," he said. "Why didn't you tell me about the trust?" "I didn't know about it until 11 months ago," I said. "And then I needed time to understand it." "You should have told me." "I'm telling you now." A long pause. "Renata feels like," he stopped. Started again. "She said some things that weren't fair." "She did," I agreed. "I should have said something earlier. When she was making those arrangements without asking you properly. I knew it wasn't right. I let that stand on its own. I didn't say, yes, you did know. I didn't say, and you called me anyway with Renata's deadline in your voice." Marco was 34 years old and had just said the words, which was not a small thing. There was something to be worked through between us, the fact that he had watched the pattern and stayed quiet, the fact that he had delivered her messages as though they were his own, and that work was not going to happen in one phone call. But the words existed now. They were in the air. "Come have dinner next week," I told him. "Just you." "Okay," he said. "Yeah. Okay." He came. He sat at my kitchen table, the same one I'd sat at the Thursday I retired, and we talked for 2 hours. Not about the trust, not about Renata's trip, not about the money. About the 15 years since he'd left for college and how quickly they had arranged themselves into something he hadn't fully examined. About his father and what it had cost me to raise Marco alone for most of those years after the divorce. About the Tuesday pickups, which he admitted he hadn't known had extended into 4 months. He had not known. That surprised me, and then it didn't. Renata had managed the logistics. She had simply not told him how the logistics worked. We didn't resolve everything that evening. We didn't try to. But he left with my leftover pot of black beans and a look on his face that was something between relief and reckoning, and I thought that was probably the right place to start. Renata sent me a text message 2 days later. It was 4 sentences. It acknowledged that she had said things that were hurtful. It did not use the word sorry, but it circled around it several times. I read it twice and set my phone down. There was more work to do there, real work, the patient kind, and I wasn't certain Renata was ready for it yet. But the text existed. That was a start. Graciela, when I told her the whole story over arroz con leche that weekend, put her spoon down and looked at me. "You waited 11 months, she said. "I wanted to understand it first," I said. She shook her head, but she was smiling. 41 years, she said. "You finally stopped explaining yourself." I have thought a lot in the months since that afternoon at the kitchen table about what it means to be seen. Not celebrated. Not thanked, though thanks would have been something. Just seen. Understood to exist as a person with her own time, her own skills, her own history, her own life continuing to move even when no one was paying attention to it. I had made myself small for a long time. Not out of weakness, I don't think it was weakness. I think it was a kind of patience that had curdled, slowly, into invisibility. The patience of someone who believed that if you kept showing up, kept doing the work, kept setting aside your own appointments and your own plans and your own roses, eventually the people you loved would look up and see what you had been doing all along. They don't always look up. Not until something changes the angle of the light. What I know now is that my time was never nothing. Every Tuesday pickup, every weekend, every folded load of laundry was something I chose, but it was a choice, not an obligation. The moment it became an obligation in someone else's mind without my consent, something shifted. Not in me. In the arrangement. The roses, as it turned out, did come back. I planted 2 new climbing varieties in April, a deep red and an apricot, and they are doing exactly what they're supposed to do. Slowly. Without anyone watching. Which is, I have come to understand, sometimes exactly the right condition for growth. If this story reminded you of someone who has been quietly showing up for people who forgot to look, share it with them. Not as an accusation. Just as a reminder that the ledger is always running, even when no one's reading it. This is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes. Names, characters, and events are fictional, and any resemblance to real persons or situations is coincidental.